From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. The other piece of this House bill that is intriguing to me and looks like it might be an improvement on the Senate bill is the substance of the objections. And so the Senate bill would continue to allow Congress to object that a given slate of electors was not, quote unquote, regularly given. And this is a term of art. This is the kind of thing that you saw being floated after the 2004 election, after 2016. And the House bill, I think, maybe makes an improvement by doing away with that and saying that if a third of Congress wants to object to some slate of electors, then they have to give their reason up front. We're not going to let them object in vague, nebulous terms and then break to debate it and give it that legitimacy. We're going to make you put it in writing in front. And so there's a specified set of complaints in this House bill. So if there's electors from a state that is not legitimately a state when the election was held, if a state sends too many electors, if electors vote on the wrong day, or if the electors are ineligible, if the president or the vice presidential candidate is ineligible. And so, Kim, the great advantage of that, in my mind, is that you can't get up and complain about the voting machines in whatever state. You have to have a specified reason in the law for objecting. And these are relatively narrow categories.
Right. And I think the way to look at this is, for those of us who have been critical of the Electoral Count Act, we've called for its full repeal. Our argument has been that Congress really shouldn't be able to stick its grubby fingers into questions of state elections, especially when procedures and state law have been followed. And yet we've seen this growing tendency of them to do that. So if you're not going to get rid of the act overall, my preference is obviously more along the lines of this, where you are not only raising the threshold for the amount of people in Congress you need to lodge an objection, but to limit those objections to things that have to do with grave issues of procedure, or as Liz Cheney said, things that are problematic as written into the Constitution. And you just outlined some of those. Now, I would point out that this in no way robs any candidate running for federal office, the president or the vice president, a team of them, from, again, engaging in some sort of litigation at a state level, whether in state courts over the way that the election went down, whether or not the ballot machines had a problem, whether or not the legislature chose the electors in the appropriate way. There are still opportunities for that to happen at the state level before certain deadlines and before governors then submit their slate. It just means that after the fact, Congress can't stand up and still be nursing grievances about this or that and engage in further delay or problems with the Electoral Count Act on issues outside of these very limited situations.
And that doesn't mean that there's no room for congressional shenanigans to take place. I mean, I can think of a couple of examples. One is that there were people who argued that John McCain was not eligible to be president even after he was nominated because he was born in the Panama Canal Zone. There are people who make a similar argument about Ted Cruz because he was born in Canada. And the other one that comes to mind is the 14th Amendment. There are people who say that the January 6th riot qualifies as an insurrection as defined under the 14th Amendment. And so people who took part in it or encouraged it are disqualified from holding offices in the United States. And that may include President Trump, as the argument goes. And so even if Congress retains the ability under this Cheney bill to adjudicate those kinds of issues, whether a candidate for president or vice president is eligible or ineligible, you can still imagine some real political fireworks taking place. And Monet, I guess my hope is that anything like that would be litigated and settled long before January 6th. I mean, maybe there's a way for a lawsuit to come up in the course of a presidential campaign, whether somebody gets ballot access, whether their name gets put on the ballot. But it strikes me as a little bit late on January 6th. That's 2 months after the election. That's 14 days before the transfer of power from one president to the next is supposed to take place. It seems to me that is a little late for Congress Congress to be waddling in and saying, well, we think this candidate is disqualified, and so we're going to throw out his presidential electors. I think that would be an explosive moment in the country.
Yeah, we should certainly hope that one of the many touch points along the sort of American federal election system would serve to settle the question of the president's eligibility long before 2 months after the election, sort of right before the president is supposed to be inaugurated. And I think that when it concerns certain qualifications, like the age of the president or whether the president is a natural-born citizen, it would be a clear-cut issue. There's no chance that you would ever have any ambiguity about that. If somebody who didn't meet that qualification was to seek the presidency, they would be challenged and the court would rule definitively on it long before the certification of the electors. But I do think with regard to the insurrection provision, and again, this is referring to the 14th Amendment disqualification of anyone who has participated in an insurrection from holding public office, there actually could be some ambiguity that would be difficult for courts to resolve. I think that the definition of what it means to take part in an insurrection is not something that is legally clear-cut. And so certainly if Trump were to run again, you would have lawsuits alleging that he'd taken part in an insurrection. But I could certainly see a scenario where judges would be a little bit timid about ruling definitively on that and say that this is a political question. So that leaves open the possibility that Congress would have to kind of step in and rule on that sort of Democrats would allege that Trump is ineligible despite him having been elected. Again, it's extremely unlikely, but I do think that that is a possibility. And so you can make an argument in that case for giving Congress the right to make a judgment on that question in the same way that Congress makes a judgment on what high crimes and misdemeanors mean in the case of impeachment. It is somewhat of a political question at the end of the day.
Kim, my final thought here is I'm not sure that this House bill is a perfect bill. I'm not sure the Senate bill is a perfect bill, but I think both are better than the status quo that we have. You know, for example, I've seen some criticism of the House bill that the cause of action allowing presidential and vice presidential candidates to sue might be a little bit too broad. It says any candidate may sue who appears on the ballot. And so I've seen criticisms that you can imagine third parties who get a fraction of the vote, a Jill Stein or someone like that, filing lawsuits everywhere because they have grievances with how some piece of the election was run, even though they're not really in competition to win the election in the first place. And so maybe there are some issues between the House and the Senate that they can hash out. But do you think that now that we have a House-passed bill, do you think that that raises pressure on the Senate to get that done or to pass their own bill and get to a conference committee? And I guess my last thought is here, why did this take so long? I mean, we're now almost 2 years from January 6th, and to me, this was one of the obvious things to do in the wake of it.
Yeah, well, one reason it took so long is because it was not a Democratic priority, which is really odd if you think about it. I mean, on the one hand, all they wanted to do was talk about January 6th, but it turns out they wanted to talk about it in a political fashion or in a way that promoted their own agenda. And so instead of talking about reform of the Electoral Count Act, which is the obvious source of the problem here, they wanted to use all this as an excuse to push along a bill that would result in their own federal takeover of state voting laws. And that was a driving priority for quite some time. Obviously, they also were more focused on President Biden's COVID bill and then infrastructure. And so the whole thing was a bit bizarre and I think really undermined the credibility of Democrats who claimed that this was such a key moment in the United States and its history that they wouldn't even move more quickly to deal with it. Now, even now, it was interesting, as you said in the opening, there were 9 Republicans who voted for this. Most of those 9 were those who had also voted to impeach Donald Trump after January 6th. I think that there would have been a great deal more support among Republicans for this were it not for the name at the top of the bill, which was Liz Cheney. She has really riled most of her Republican colleagues, and that alone, regardless of the merit or the substance of a bill, seemed to be enough to put off some more Republicans from taking part of it. This should add to some pressure for the Senate to act, but as usual, here's the problem, is that we are running out of time. The Senate and the House are are in session really only for the rest of this week and only a partial week given the Rosh Hashanah holiday. They've got to get a continuing resolution done in order to keep the government lights on. And then they are all eager to rush out of town and go back and campaign. There's a possibility that this could maybe come up in the lame duck after the election is over. But again, time is just growing short.
Thank you, Kim and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we will be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.